Sorry?
Yeah. Recently,
You send me a link? Where you send it to me by?
Google. I'm online, by the way.
All right, let's get started. I wanted to thank everyone for coming to the teach-in that we're hosting as a part of a week of action alongside the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Oppression and the United States Palestine Community Network. First, we're going to hear from a presentation from Dr. Abdulhadi. Dr. Rabab Abdulhadi is a Palestinian American scholar and activist who has studied in Yale and who has work ranging from anti-colonial struggle to gender to Black Lives Matter. Yeah, and Dr. Abdulhadi, if you want to start on your presentation.
Well, first of all, I think it's good afternoon where you are. Thank you so much for having me. I start first of all by acknowledging that my own university sits on unceded and indigenous Ohlone people's land. And I'm currently on the east coast of the US, which is the Lenape people's displaced land, which also in many ways is similar to the Palestinian displacements. Secondly, I want to thank you for having me. And I'm actually very happy to be in company with the young generation, the new generation of students for a democratic society, Palestine Solidarity Committee, and all of you who are organizing. SDS played a very, very important role in the 60s in terms of opposing the war in Vietnam, of demanding a change to the society, of connecting with other struggles. There were, of course, many positive outcomes, and there were a lot of challenges as well. And we learned from those histories. And part of the reason I'm also very excited is because my own university, San Francisco State, was the place where the longest student strike in the history of the US took place. That's the 1968 student strike, led by this Black Student Union and the Third World Liberation Front. That was a strike that demanded decolonizing the curriculum, demanding refusal to erect boundaries between the university and the community, and demanded that the university be accountable to the community. As a result of this strike, the students demanded a College of Third World Studies. They were against the war in Vietnam. They were anti-imperialist. They were anti-Zionist. They were for the liberation of all people. And as the outcome of it is they demanded the College of Third World Studies. The university gave them a College of Ethnic Studies, hoping that they'll be able to make it kind of like all ethnics come together and so on. It didn't really work. This is not our topic today. We can talk about that some other time. But I think it's really, really important. And the third axis for me is that I grew up. The 60s, the late 60s was actually when my coming of age. I'm Palestinian, born and raised in the city of Nablus in Palestine. So I actually don't consider myself Palestinian American, even though I live in the US. I have a problem identifying with the quote unquote America label because of what the US history has been about as a settler colonial regime that also engaged in kidnapping and the enslavement of African people, attempt the genocide of indigenous folks, and has been throughout its history, has been nothing but repression. It's actually, that's what it is. So even when people say today that we would like to go back to our values, I always ask, what are the values? Which values are you talking about? So this is part of why I actually I'm really excited. I'm also very honored and happy that you have been struggling day in and day out. That SDS is being revived in under different banner with different principles and with more awareness and consciousness to questions of racial justice, to question of indigenous justice, to question of international justice. So that's very, very important. And these are not empty words. So it's really great. And also you have been struggling against the Jewish National Fund, which is a very colonial agency that its name does not make it sound as such what we do know. And I have been actually to many places in Palestine with delegations where we visited villages like al-Hiran, for example, in Naqab area, that's being destroyed. And in its place, a settlement called Hiran is being set up with the money of the Jewish National Fund. Jewish National Fund controls over 90% of the land of historic Palestine and is trying to actually take more. And it is engaged in what they call, quote unquote, they claim that they're creating in the parks in the Israeli park, but what they're doing is actually they're uprooting and erasing everything that's Palestinian, including the indigenous trees, the environment, changing the whole environment to make it sound as if Palestinians have never been there. Another site that we've been visiting a lot and connecting with is one of the villages that wasn't destroyed. 532 villages were destroyed in 1948, completely erased in 1948, when the Nakba, or the catastrophe, the large displacement of Palestinians took place. Between 700,000, 800,000 Palestinians were displaced at gunpoint and forced out of their land. And one of the villages wasn't destroyed, Ain Hod. It was actually turned into an Israeli artist colony for liberal Israeli artists. And in many places, they have a place where it says, this is the Yemen Park built by the Jewish National Fund. And the people of Ain Hod, the original people, live not very, very far from, give me a minute. Can you just go on shut the screen if you don't mind, Jaime? Okay, all right. So the people of Ain Hod, some of them live in the Jenin refugee camp. Many of them were killed in the multiple times of attacks of the Jenin refugee camps. Many of them have been are living in Jordan in refugee camps, and some of them are still living there, not far from their village. And every week they go to clean the cemetery that has been destroyed again and again and again. And some of these things that I'm mentioning to you now are also very relevant to what's happening today, because we know when we think about Gaza today, aside from almost 30,000 people who've been killed, murdered, the injuries, the disappeared, the destruction of the culture of the homes, denial of food, denial of water, denial of shelter that is happening. And I can discuss that in details if people would like to talk about that, but I'm sure you're familiar with a lot of it. We also cemeteries have been destroyed, that people have been buried in mass graves. So there is a lot of continuity with the past and the present. And one of the questions I was asked to respond to is, how does this genocide compare to genocides in the past? So I'm going to basically respond to the organizers send me several questions. So I'm going to go through them. And please intervene if you would like to ask other questions. So I think this question basically speaks to 2 points. One is, how does this genocide of Palestinians speak to genocide of Palestinians in the past? And how does this particular genocide in Gaza speak to genocide in general? So let me address the two. I began by saying that I believe the US is a settler colonial state that actually has been engaged in deliberate genocide attempt to decimate the indigenous people who are the indigenous people of the lands. And so this is something that has been systemic, consistent. We have a lot of historic proof. We have writings about it. We have history we're studying. We still don't know everything that is there, because we know that usually the colonists are the ones who write the history, are the ones who keep the archives and so on. Similarly with Palestine, this is it's what people are saying today in Gaza, and we don't want it to become another Nakba, another 1948. And it's actually getting even worse than the 1948 Nakba with the outright license to kill, the murder of people left and right. It's such a huge number. in such a short period of time. And I don't want to get fixated on numbers because I want to honor the Palestinians, writers, poets, activists who keep saying we are not numbers. So I don't want to only talk about numbers, but numbers do matter as well. And why is this a genocide? Not only because the International Court of Justice, the case that South Africa launched against Israel, said that this is genocide. It is genocide. It is genocide in the sense that this is a settler colonial project of Zionism for over 100 years. It was set up in Palestine to basically, and its intent to get rid of the Palestinians, because if you keep the Palestinians, if you don't get rid of the Palestinians, if you don't get rid of their presence on the land, if you don't erase them completely, it becomes really difficult to fulfill the Zionist slogan, a land without a people for a people without a land. Shut it down. And so it's, could you please hold me?
Yeah.
Apologies, I'm having some sounds in the house. So now I'm back. Okay. So, oh, sorry. Can you see? Oh, so this is the Zionist project says a people without a land for a land without a people, and actually it goes way back, even before Zionism, and it goes way back centuries earlier, from colonists, Christian Zionist colonists who have advocated that this is something that needed to happen. There is a whole long history to it, and it was adopted by the Zionist movement. And so just briefly, I'm sure many of you know about that, but the Zionist project was set up at the end of the 19th century and continued with the beginning of the 20th century in order, it was one way to address rising anti-Semitism in Europe, and the pogroms and the ghettos and the discrimination against Jews in particular. And it was set up by the father, they call it the spiritual father of Zionism, Herzl, Theodor Herzl, who basically founded it and solidified it in 1987 in the first Zionist conference in Switzerland, Basel, Switzerland. And this was one possibility of how do we address the question of anti-Semitism. I think it's also important to remember that there were many other ways to address anti-Semitism and how to discuss it. For example, for many of you who may know or not, there is an important essay that was written by Karl Marx called On the Jewish Question. There were many members of the Jewish and the non-Jewish communities who were talking about how do we address the whole question of racism, racialization, discrimination against any people on the basis of race, gender, nationality, religion, culture, history, and so on and so forth. And so one of the possibilities that Karl Marx, for example, advocated is that one of the ways to address anti-Semitism, and didn't call it anti-Semitism at that time, but called it about the whole rising discrimination against Jews, is to fight against all forms of injustices and connected with each other. And then when we fight against all forms of injustices, we actually will be struggling against today what we're talking about, Islamophobia, the question of anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian discrimination, anti-Blackness, against indigenous communities, against Asians, Latinx, and all communities, and which I would refer to in my own analysis as the framework of the indivisibility of justice. In other words, that if we understand that we should not accept injustice against any people, whether we're talking about the late 19th century anti-Semitism in European context, or we're talking about what's happening to Palestine today, or we're talking about the killing of young and not so young Black people, if we're talking about the border that's actually colonial border that the US set up and says that immigrants are unable to come in and people are persecuted and so on, which is in many ways is similar. It's even built by the wall is built by the same wall as the apartheid wall in Palestine, El-Beit system, which there is a very big boycott campaign against it. So if we're thinking about that, if we think about focusing on fighting for justice for all, rather than exceptionalizing one kind of injustice and say this is the only one we would work about, would be a different recipe However, the Zionist movement actually thought and made deals with the colonial powers in Europe to basically address two issues for the anti-Semites in Europe. They wanted to get rid of the Jews. For the Zionists, particularly, they thought about setting up a state, a Jewish state in anywhere. Uganda was mentioned, Argentina, and then it settled on Palestine because they could claim some religious roots with Palestine, even though the Zionists actually were a-religious, were not religious at all, but it seemed to be convenient. And in that bargain with the colonial powers in Europe, and I say colonialism because colonialism was developed so much in Europe by that time, from the 14th century, especially kind of a lot of it was developed around 1492, and which is also the moment that we see the settler colonial project being established in the Americas. But this is there is something about the colonial connection between the Zionist movement and the colonial powers, as well as the capitalist class in Europe, that in a way it will get for Europe, it will get rid of the Jews. And for the Zionists, they will be able to set up a state. And historically, the Zionist movement has always exceptionalized the question about persecution of Jews, anti-Semitism, and so on. But we know that many anti-Zionist groups and so on are talking about never again for anyone, not just never again for Jews, never again the Holocaust. So, and if we think about what's going on today in Gaza, there are a lot of similarities. Not everything is the same, of course. So we don't want to conflate context at all, whether we talk about indigeneity, whether we talk about Blackness, Africa, Asia, Latin America, anywhere in the world. It's really important to think each context has its own context specificity. There are similarities and there are differences. So genocide in itself means that there is a complete destruction of a people. And what is going on today in Gaza is a genocide, that the case actually legally was set up by the South African legal team. But this is something that Palestinians also have known about throughout, because we've grown up and we've witnessed again and again from the history that we don't even know, our parents and our grandparents know, there has been complete attempt to erase anything, the food, the culture, the music, the trees, to come up with myths that this is a land without a people, for a people without a land, but also that this was arid land, that Israel made the Zionists made the desert bloom, that they came and modernized and so on, which a lot of it is very colonialist, imperialist, orientalist tropes and so on. So this is, I think this is something that we can also expand on about a lot, but I want to also get to all the questions so we can have time for discussion, because I'm sure you have a lot of more questions. The second question that was posed to me is that there has been a lot of talk about, oh, sorry, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Do you want to pose them yourself, Khalid? That would be better.
No, I just wanted to introduce our other other speaker for today. We have today we have with us Abdullah Alaga, a Palestine organizer with the Colorado Palestine Coalition. So the question that the professor just answered was, how does this genocide compare to genocides in the past? And then if you have any words that you want to say before I move on to the next one.
Oh, okay, perfect. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I wanna go to something that actually Dr. Abdulhadi mentioned. And I want to say, Dr. Abdulhadi, it's an honor to meet you. You know, albeit virtually. I'm a huge fan of yours. Your statement on you know, this being worse than the Nakba, I think it's safe for us to call this a second Nakba. You know, more Palestinians, twice as many Palestinians, over twice as many Palestinians have been displaced in the last 4 months than were displaced in 1948. You know, more have been killed than were killed in 1948. This is absolutely a second Nakba, and I think that the way we're going to be talking about this, you know, and it feels weird to say this, but in a historical context down the line, is going to be as a second Nakba. You know, we had a first Intifada and a second Intifada. It's sort of like the same thing. So it's really interesting that like we're kind of already having those conversations about like nomenclature and how we're going to be referring to this. To the question of how this compares to other genocides, I think the one thing that is really unique about this one is how live streamed it is. You know, we are seeing every single moment of this on a very personal level. Like there are people, like people know the names like Wa'il Dahtuh, Mu'taz, Bisan, like we have personal connection with these people who we've never met before, who are essentially live streaming this genocide for us right now. So I think in previous, you know, in historically when things like this have happened, you know, we look back at them and we're like, how was this allowed to happen? You know, it's almost like we assume that they happened quietly, you know, which is not always the case. It's often not the case, as a matter of fact. And here it's happening very, very, very loudly. And yet still, we're just sitting and watching it happen. So I think that's very interesting. And I do feel like this is going to change the framing of these sorts of flashpoint events and genocides in the future. I mean, hopefully we don't see another one in our lifetime or ever again. But I do think that it's very interesting that we can't look back on these things that we say about other genocides, you know, like the Armenian genocide, like the Holocaust. How was this able to happen? You know, as if they were just carried out in secret. Well, you know, here we are. We're watching this unfold, and yet the world still sits back. So I think it really sheds a light on fundamental issues that we have as a civilization, really, that we are willing to witness these things in real time, and just kind of sit back and really pontificate on like what the meaning of genocide is, and you know that it's really quite absurd, honestly, is what it is. It's really absurd. But you know, we do have to kind of try to frame it in a historical framing, just to try to make sense of it, as difficult as that may be. So I think that to me is really the biggest difference that sticks out from this and other genocides. And I would also like to mention, you know, you brought up the JNF, you know, and their parks and how they use those parks to whitewash. I don't know if people know this, but there's actually a JNF park called Coretta Scott King Park, and it is on top of an ethnically cleansed Palestinian village. I think it's called Auraria. And as a matter of fact, there are still ruins of that village in the middle of Coretta Scott King Park. So you can go look up pictures of it, and there's ruins of old Palestinian buildings on top of the park. So I know I jumped around a lot. You covered a lot of incredible things, Dr. Abdulhadi. Thank you again so much. But yeah, I just wanted to point that out, that you know, this whitewashing that they do is really, really insidious. And it even goes a step further. You know, like there's like Canada Park, and there's like the British National Park in Israel. So these are what the branches of the JNF do in the countries where they operate. You know, so like when the JNF came here, and you know, we all talked about it as like, this is a foreign entity coming here to fundraise in Denver, and this is absurd. And you know, I was kind of listening to what Zionists were saying about that, and you know, one of the leaders of the JNF, he said, I don't understand why they're framing us this way. Like, we're an American nonprofit. You know, they try to whitewash themselves and say they're just like an American nonprofit. Okay, well, where is the money that you're raising going? Is it going to causes in America? No, it's going to plant forests on top of ethnically cleansed Palestinian villages. So I really do, I appreciated you bringing that up, Dr. Abdulhadi. I think there's really so many layers to the evil of the Jewish National Fund. And part of it is how many different shapes they've taken on. You know, before 1948, you know, one of the things that they would do is they would map out Palestinian villages and what they call the village files, which is what was used by the Zionist militias in 1948 to ethnically cleanse Palestine. And then upon the creation of Israel, they sort of took on a different form, you know, planting these national forests and stuff. And nowadays it's like they do like water conservation research, which is really just stealing water from Palestinian territories and from surrounding countries as well. So it's really interesting. And I would also like to mention that the work we did here with the JNF was absolutely amazing. And I want to hand it off to SDS for like all the amazing work they did for that. The conference they did was a yearly conference. They do this in a different city every single year. And I really do firmly believe that we should put together everything that we did to fight back against the JNF here and package it and hand it off to other cities wherever the JNF might go to help them, you know, organize against the JNF. I don't know what they're going to do next year. Are they going to go to a very small city where there's no Palestinian presence? I don't know, but I do feel like we should be prepared to mobilize against them again next, you know, wherever they end up next, just because of how insidious they are and how ingrained they are in Zionist culture and kind of the way they frame themselves. So yeah, I know I jumped around a lot there, but yeah, that's
No, yeah, thank you
That's
so
fine.
much.
I just want to know what's the plan now? Is somebody else going to comment? So it's what we're going to do.
Oh, yeah. I know there was talk about wanting to speak on colonial feminism.
Yeah, but I think before that, I actually had some like comments to kind of like respond to Khalid, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And not in response in terms of debate, but to actually build. Yeah, I don't disagree that it is a second Nakba, but I actually think that we're even seeing now the genocide, as you said, in plain sight. But it also raises the question that did really people not know about earlier genocide? Or did they knew and stop? And the same today, as today, people know, they're seeing it day in and day out. So what's happening? Why is the word not moving on? I mean, there is big part of the word that's moving, but then the part of the word that's in circles of power that actually can make a decision, whether we're talking the U.S. Government and genocide, Joe, or we're talking about Europeans and so on. And like, why are they not doing it? And what's going on here? And we can't just attribute it to just hate or ignorance only, because they do know what's going on. They get the reports. So I think this is another question that is raised about is that it is important to educate and inform, and I think it's really more important to even inform ourselves, to engage in these kind of conversations, to kind of like figure out where we're at. And we don't have to have the same language, the same formulation, the same framing, that's fine. But I think also is that, so what does this really mean? Because a lot of the people, and I remember like in 1982 when Israel invaded Lebanon, there was a very big poster by the Israeli peace movement that had the soldiers' boot on the neck of a Palestinian kid, and I said, just don't say you didn't know. So how many times we're going to do that? How many times you're going to say you just didn't know? You just didn't know. You know. The question is, what are you going to do about it? And is it okay? Is the Palestinian life today, or if we're talking about indigenous life, Black life, is this less valuable than the life of other people? This is kind of like a very big also wordplay of what is happening now. I also wanted to just say one word about the Coretta Scott King Park, because I was actually around when there was a Palestinian nonviolent organizer by the name of Mubarak Awad in 1988 who appealed. We were actually at the Democratic National Convention in Atlanta when Jesse Jackson was running, and we were participating in order for us to interject in the political struggle, because, you know, we, as many of you probably know, electoral politics doesn't make it all. If there isn't a movement, it's sort of like it could complement the movement, but it's not the only be it all. So we went there because we set up a tent and said Palestinians don't have a state and so on. And Mubarak Awad appealed to Coretta Scott King and wrote to her and said that, you know, there is a park that's being made in your name and your husband's name on the land of Palestinians. And I think at that time she said to him, she didn't acknowledge, and she just said, thank you for donating the land. But this is very interesting, because now that we are in Black History Month, actually it's really good for us to think about that. Several things happened. One, Israel deported Mubarak Awad. So forget even violence and non-violence doesn't really work. So when people kind of say, if you only go with non-violent, you could convince the world. It didn't work for Martin Luther King because he was martyred. It didn't work for Mubarak Awad it doesn't work to only think about one kind of resistance. We have to think and be able to support people who need self-determination and liberation and everything. But secondly, when I went to the Martin Luther King Center and saw it, there isn't a single thing about Israel in the whole center. Because, you know, there is this whole thing about the letter from Martin Luther King to a Jewish friend and so on, which doesn't exist. It turns out to be a hoax. It actually was proved to be a hoax and so on. So none of this is actually there, which means that there was a realization. And then we know that from the second generation, from the civil rights movement and so on, that was with Martin Luther King, but they do not condone what Israel is doing in Palestine and so on. So, and the morale of the story is sort of like several things. One is that the Jewish National Fund does take Palestinian land and does use propaganda, or hasbara, as we say, misinformation, in order to actually make it palatable for those who do not know, to encourage and expand the settler colonial project at the expense of Palestinians, the way other settlers do. Two, and we know this is a lie. We know that this is a lie. We know that there are parks all over Palestine and so on. And by the way, in Hod, just to go back to that, there have been many fires there, and Israel always accuses Palestinians of setting on fires. By the way, the investigation always determines that this is not really the case. But part of the reason is because they plant European trees in order to remove the habitat, the environmental habitat indigenous of the Palestinians, and say that this is actually European, and these trees don't live there. So every single time they're very much subjected to fires. So that also part of like, and then the third thing is that things do move. So even if there was in the 60s, early 60s, let's say, majority, let's say, of the of the spoken people of the Black Civil Rights Movement, not everybody, because we know Malcolm X, Black Panther Party, SNCC, or Robert F. Williams, and so on. That's another discussion. But they all spoke out and so on. But also the civil rights movement that was much more sort of like, let's say, mainstream, had the politics of respectability and so on, changed a lot to the point of actually condemning Israel and calling it apartheid. So also that's also something that we can say, things do not stay what they are for people of good conscience, and for people whose interests are not tied up with the interests of the settler colonial military industrial project. There is possibilities to change if there are people who do not know. Then we provide the information, we provide the discussion, we engage in a very sort of like equivalent sibling way. But for the folks who are already in power, who are pouring money and military aid to Israel and so on, supplying it again and again, using veto and so on, like Genocide Joe and company, that there is no changing, because it's not that they do not know. They do know. They actually know, and they are determined, because the Palestinian movement and the Palestinian liberation movement, like other liberation movements around the world, stands against their own interests. The more it expands, the more these forces lose in power, in military industries, in expanding influence around the world, in controlling the oil of the region, and so on. So in every single thing, there is a polarizing. Definitely, there are people on one side, there are people on the other side, and the more and more and more the struggle around Palestine is also, as well as other struggles, especially like the whole question after the Black Intifada of 2020 and so on. It shows where people are standing up and whose interests are lining up with whom. So we see white supremacy, Zionism, anti-environmental, the people who actually want to like create militias and go around shooting everybody and so on. All of them are actually in one side of the aisle, and the rest of the world is another side of the aisle, which also witnesses a very big distance that Palestine solidarity work has also traveled. And I will stop at that for see what if you want to raise the next question, Khalid or comment.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for your answer. The next question is, there's been a lot of talk about what's happening to the Palestinian people and how it's simple, or that there are only two sides. What are your thoughts on that statement and the people who argue against it?
Thank you. I think, well, first of all, of course, there's multiple sides, but the way they say that it is, first of all, they say it is too complicated because they don't want to deal with it, or they'll say it's divisive, but we always, I mean, I think it's always important to flip the question on the other side. And one of my inspirations are the interview that Ghassan Kanafani, I don't know how many of you know of it, made with Australian TV, that every single time this colonial reporter asked him question, he flipped the question around and raised and did not accept any of the questions on the terms of the colonizers. So when they say to us, it's like it's complicated, we say, what's so complicated about justice and injustice? When they say it's two sides, they're actually saying that there is equivalence to Palestinian demands for self-determination and Zionist demands for quote-unquote self-determination. And we know that you cannot equate the colonizers and the colonized. Anti-Zionism does not equal Zionism, and there is no right to set up a settler colonial state on the land of Palestine or anywhere in the world, whether it is, we're talking about the US, South Africa, we're talking about Puerto Rico, anywhere, Philippines, anywhere in the world. It is wrong. It's wrong. And I think when I say it's wrong and right, of course, because we do have also a moral compass by which we go. Of course, they say about, like sometimes when the way today sometimes say it is that we need to say we feel really bad for the captives, the Israeli captives that are in the hand of the Palestinian resistance. And we talk about two sides, but then nobody actually speaks about the almost over 7,000 Palestinian prisoners. Before actually October 7th, there were about 4,000. The numbers now has almost doubled with Palestinian prisoners who are get nobody, like the whole world doesn't think about that. And now there are Israeli captives, which, by the way, incidentally, just whether you agree or you disagree, historically, the Palestinian movement, every single operation they carried out, it was always with the call of liberating prisoners. Because prisoners, after the martyrs, are icons for the Palestinian people. It's people, I mean, think about it, not just for the Palestinian people. Think about it, if you don't have freedom, what does this really mean? What does it mean to be caged in an open-air prison in Palestine, in Gaza, with the blockade and so on, in prison itself, not being able to go out to breathe, not being able, and all the prisoners, Palestinian prisoners who've been released in the latest 7 rounds of negotiations, they all come out, they say how much they've been beaten up, they haven't had food, they were attacked, there were sexual violence against them, and younger kids too, and they were not even allowed to see their families. Historically, Palestinian prisoners have always waged hunger strike after hunger strike, sometimes to just fight for the thickness of the mattress, but sometimes to be able to fight to get education, because many times Palestinian prisoners win that with the prison movement hunger strikes, and then Israeli prison takes it away every single time. Now, the situation is actually even worse than it has ever been, both because of the context in general that not enabling us to talk enough about what's happening with the Palestinian prisoners, because there's so many things that we need to be struggling over, especially to stop the bloodshed, the genocide that's going on in Gaza, and get people to have food, water, medicine, not to have the babies in the incubators die and so on. But when you think about it, there sometimes Palestinian prisoners want things, but now the head of the one who's in charge of prison authorities is Ben-Gvir. And he has been very clear about that. To all the gains that Palestinian prisoners win in hunger strikes, the Israeli prison authority, which is not only the state, because now there are private, just like the US, by the way, private companies that are running prisons as well. And to them, the more money, think about Michelle Alexander argument in the new Jim Crow, and the ways in which imprisonment today is like, it's similar to the slave, not exactly the same, but it's similar to slave labor, using labor of enslaved people for free for the benefit of the folks who are compiling, accumulating capital and money, the 99%, the 1%. So if you think about that, every time they fight for it, at one point, Palestinian prisoners were able to take exams in school, in the prison. But now what Israel has been doing is every time there are school exams, and they happen across the whole country, the matriculation exam, everybody has to take it. They go and arrest people they raid overnight, or they beat them up in prison, or they impose curfew or something, even prevent them to be able to have education. I mean, sometimes they take away, when they punish them, they'll take away the pencils and the paper, denying them even the ability to be creative because, you know, one of the ways that you survive in prison, and everybody in prison literature knows, is when you are able to dissociate maybe your body from your mind and keep your mind liberated and try to struggle as much. It's very difficult, especially with solitary confinement and so on. But also writing, creating artwork, and so on. They take all these tools, not only preventing people from going out for the 1 hour a day to the sun, not allowing people to engage with each other, punishing prisoners whenever they feel that they need to punish, they actually transfer. They call them transfer from one place to the other, which in itself, by the way, is against international law, because you're not supposed to be transporting population from occupied areas to the occupied, based on the Fourth Geneva Convention that Israel signed, being mindful of deportation of Jews in Europe. So when they do that, they continue to transfer in order to break down either the organization of prisoners, the prison movement in prison, or to punish them, or to do one thing or another. Nobody talks about that. And this is when we see people take about two sides. I say, okay, what are the two sides? Is anybody talking about what's happening to the Palestinians? Is anybody talking about what does it really mean for the Israeli war minister? It's not defense or anything. Minister of war to say we're going to starve you, we're going to cut off electricity, we're going to cut off water. This is what you're going to be, not only your animals, but we're going to actually prevent you from every single possibility to live. What is that if that's not genocide? And when Palestinians speak, and the way the Palestinian resistance treated the captives and so on is a very, very different way. And the captives come out and they speak, but now Israeli government is controlling them. They do not allow them to speak to anybody. They take them and they set them up. Some of them who have been saying a lot of things, kind of like saying, well, we were treating humanly. This Palestinian fighter taught my kid to learn this. This other person, you know, put a kerchief between my hand and he's a woman because it's haram to touch a woman's hand or something. None of that stuff is already now completely absent from the media, completely. And the only stories we hear about the folks who have basically gone to deprogramming camps by the Israeli intelligence and the police and so on, who are kind of like this intensified Zionization, which wasn't there after October 7th, because October 7th, the families of the captives were demanding that their children be released. Now, we know that there is members of the captive families that are actually blocking the Ain Kerem with the checkpoint between Israel and Gaza, preventing even food from going in. Who can do that? Like, how could people even conceptualize of denying other people food and water and electricity and medicine? And so I think this is, I mean, I think it's a huge obscene way to think about two sides. And in everything too, is kind of like flip it around and see, like if we flip it around and think about it from the viewpoint of the colonized, of the marginalized, how would the story look like? Would it look the same way as the story that the New York Times is telling us, or CNN, or Piers Morgan, or President Biden, or Blinken? Is that the story we're hearing? No, it's not. It's a very different story.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on to our next question. So what do people mean when they say that Israel is a settler colonial project?
We already like addressed that in the first one, so maybe we can, if we have time, we can come back to it later on.
Okay,
Is that okay? Yeah.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, okay. So recently, the aid to UNRWA has been cut very abruptly. In your view, why were so many countries quick to cut aid to this UN department?
Yeah, I think there is a multiple level to it. First of all, just for people who do not know, UNRWA is United Nations Relief and Work Agency for Palestinian Refugees. It was set up after the Nakba in 1948. Let's say the first Nakba in 1948. And it was set up as a specific agency to deal with Palestinian refugees. Now, it's very interesting also to think about, if you want to think about refugee studies, in 1950, the United Nations passed the Refugee Convention. And the refugee in the United Nations lingo, it's very different than the UNRWA one, is that the objective is to settle refugees. While UNRWA, one of the main objectives is to implement Resolution 194 of the United Nations that demands that the Palestinians have the right to return. or be compensated if they wish to. But the basic thing is it's inalienable rights, meaning that nobody has the right to make any decision about except the refugees themselves. Nobody. Whoever says that doesn't, it's not really valid according to international law. So UNRWA set up 59 refugee camps throughout the region, in Palestine, in let's say West Bank, Gaza, in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Syria, and was manding Palestinians with schools, with food, with so on. It was never enough. And Palestinian movement has always had to supplement. So every refugee camp has its own committee, popular committee, that actually conducts the affairs of the refugees, Palestinians, talks about them and so on. And there have been many protests, by the way, against UNRWA for the recent period. Many times teachers strike because they're not getting enough pay. Members of the refugee camps complain because there isn't enough clinics. People say that we cannot have the kids in the school go on 3 shifts. They need to have enough education and so on. Not to mention the curriculum itself also has been changed a lot based on what Israeli demands, to remove any references in the curriculum that Palestinians learn that maybe encourage them to be proud, to stand up with their heads high, to support Palestinian liberation and so on, because Israel is intent on imposing submission, subjugation, and surrender on the Palestinians. But nonetheless, UNRWA is the agency that has been providing UNRWA with World Health Organization, World Food Organization, UNICEF, the Children's One, all of them international agencies are the only ones who have the ability to move freely in Gaza. I mean, freely, relatively speaking, and be able to provide food. If we remember, Trump cut money down to UNRWA in order to basically strangulate the Palestinian people. If we recall, Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, was treating Palestine as a real estate issue. That, oh, this is just real estate, not a problem, we will deal with it, and so on. Went to Bahrain, did this whole workshop trying to even bribe. Not a single Palestinian will go. People refuse to even be part of that. And part of shutting down UNRWA is part of cutting the lifeline to the Palestinian refugees, because this is the first line of defense, because it's the one that's recognized by, let's say, government of Lebanon, and by all the governments, Jordan, Syria, by the Israelis, even the West Bank and Gaza and so on. So historically, this is the agency with all its problems. It's the agency that has been providing all. So Trump and the US cut down its donations a lot. Biden says that he's going to be restoring. They didn't restore all the aid. But now it is in order to regulate the Palestinian people even more, to target this agency that's dealing with Palestinian refugees and providing food and medicine and supplies and fuel and so on. So this is why this is additional pressure on the Palestinians, which means that these countries are actually part and parcel of genocide. They're not innocent. They're not even distant. They're not like just say they're nasty and they're far away. They're complicit. They're directly complicit in the genocide that's going on, because they're also denying the food to be available to Palestinians. They are denying the water. They are denying the schools. This is why there is so much. And then this whole thing based on some Israeli report that actually is not really verified. We know how Israel is really great at creating misinformation. And the more they get stuck, they create even bigger lies. And then they don't even come up with lies that we can believe. The lies get so big and they keep expanding. So this is why they're trying to strangulate UNRWA. And now some governments are feeling so ashamed of themselves because they also have been so exposed that some of the support has been retrieved, but not by the US government. The US government is giving Israel weapons, supplying them with more, replenishing all the weapons they're losing, and more, and at the same time cutting off any possibilities of lifeline for the Palestinians to survive. So they're actually part and parcel, complicit with the genocide and the blood of Palestinians on their hands directly, not even indirectly.
Okay. I also want to remind everyone that we have some snacks and drinks up here if anybody would like any. Okay, and then so the next question is, your work covers a very large area, from anti-colonial struggle to gender to Black Lives Matter. I'm sure any one of those are capable of taking up a lifetime of research. Why take such a spread out approach when it comes to injustices?
There's several reasons. Part of them have to do with my life that I was, before I even went to school, I was a community organizer. So as a community organizer with multiple Palestinian community groups, from students to women to solidarity to centers and so on and so forth, we always work with all groups and so on. So I've also learned a lot. But from communicating with different people, I was one of the main organizers, especially in New York City, the East Coast, and nationally in the whole the U.S. But secondly, I really believe in the indivisibility of justice. So if we talk about the indivisibility of justice and the project that now we kind of like formalize it into teaching Palestine pedagogical praxis, and the indivisibility of justice speaks about multiple ways. One of the ways which I talked about centering the marginalized, placing them at the center of analysis and telling their stories rather than subjecting their stories to critique by the dominant and hegemonic forces, one thing. But the other aspect of it is what I call comparative resistance, comparative movements, and so on. So I'm always interested, like I was talking about the 68, for example. Think about what happened at that period in different parts of the world. And was it only the free speech movement at UC Berkeley or only at Columbia University, or were so many movements like in not only May 68 in Paris, but also in Tunisia, in Senegal, in Mexico on October 2nd, the army intervened and killed students right inside the university. And so when we think about that, if we think about the moment in time, and I think it's sort of very telling, and as a teacher, it also, like for me, makes it possible to bring concepts that people may not know about and maybe like very alien to them because this is not their context and so on, to make it possible to see what's happening at any particular period in time, what was going on here and there. But also it's really helpful to trace the connections that people were doing, the organizing, the solidarity, the meetings. I'm kind of like I learned so much from every single movement I was getting involved in, whether I'm talking about the South African movement, whether about the Patrice Lumumba Coalition and the Black Liberation Movement, December 12 Coalition, whether I'm talking about the Center Against Apartheid at the UN, African National Congress, SWAPO, Steve Biko's Black Consciousness Movement, whether I'm talking about Black Panthers, Black Liberation Army, the Indigenous American Indian Movement, the Puerto Rican movement, the Chicano movement, everywhere. I mean, everybody, you learn from it. And I don't think actually we can understand what's happening with Palestine, especially when we are in a context like the US, without also understanding what's going on. It's also really important because it is in the struggle to de-exceptionalize Palestine. Because what Israel does and what the Zionist movement does is say it's always exceptional. This is exceptional. This is not like everything else. And the way they do it then, they separate people from each other. And they also tell marginalized communities, not your business to talk about this. This is a foreign issue that doesn't concern you. This is something that you should just take care of your own internal affairs, which is actually quite insulting and patronizing and racist, because it assumes that only certain body of people who graduate from top universities with a lot of money and they reproduce themselves, the leading class reproduces itself again and again, are the only ones who are able, because they're talking heads and because they've been appointed in foreign policy or foreign affairs in Washington, D.C., right? So they're the only ones who can weigh in. But the rest of us cannot actually speak about that because we're not experts enough, right? So I think this is really important to kind of say, no, everybody has an interest in it. It's also because the U.S. borders, actually, the U.S. policies and regression and so on does not stop at U.S. borders. U.S. policy, whether you want to, and I put it in parentheses, foreign and domestic, they are very much connected with each other. What happens everywhere, they're very much connected. And if we trace, especially today, actually, a lot of it's becoming even clearer today, they are very much connected with each other. So I think that for me, when I see any victory for any people around the world, is a victory for Palestine. And any victory for Palestine is a victory for any people around the world. Because I believe that, I'm talking about the people who are seeking freedom, justice, liberation, the indivisibility of justice. They do not, no people think that they are better than others. We're not engaging in ranking oppression. We're not engaging in competition. And we do not allow those who are oppressing us to throw crumbs at us and go fight over it. We refuse to be pitted against each other. We refuse to divide and conquer, because that's a colonial rule. So actually, when we connect with each other, we learn a lot from each other. I just published an article last week in Arabic comparing to think about the experience of Vietnam and Palestine. Kind of like what, and Palestinians learn so much, and they've every single newspaper, article, speech, all throughout the 60s. You can, if you don't see Vietnam once, you see it 3, 4 different times, quoting Jia, quoting Ho Chi Minh, and so on. There is so much like learning from other movement, learning from Cuba, learning from the US. I mean, there is less of that because historically the US propaganda has been so damaging to the people who are struggling here, the people's movement. So everybody thinks, when people think average America, they're thinking white, middle class, male, hetero, Anglo. I mean, there is a particular prototype when people say this is the average American, right? And I actually refuse to even use the word American because I would say you people in the US. And it's also, I don't say citizen because not everybody has citizenship. So I think if we think about that and we think about how we come to each other, it's also important to learn about it. You can't just speak without actually knowing what you're talking about. Things I don't know about, honestly, my students teach me. When I teach, I'm teaching a course now on comparative border studies, Palestine and Mexico. I expect that I'm going to learn a lot because I'm talking about Palestine, Arab Botswana, compared with Mexico, Latin America, and the Caribbean. I'm learning a lot from my students because I don't know everything. I don't know everything when I work with people around Kashmir, or we work with people about the Rohingya, or we talk about Vietnam, or we talk about South Africa, or other parts of Africa. There is so many differences, even contexts that are closer, like Algeria. We do not know everything. We can learn. And we also, even Palestinians ourselves, learn from other Palestinians and their own realities and the conditions they live under. And I think this makes for a better way to understand the world. It makes for a better way to frame and understand how we can formulate our resistance, our collaboration with each other, our working with each other, and always being there to kind of like have each other's back, even if we're not necessarily engaged in the same struggle day in and day out, which, of course, we can't get engaged in every single struggle. But if we think of us as being part of the world, and I'm talking about the justice world, I'm not talking about it in sort of multiculti neoliberal way. I'm talking about in real radical committed terms. If we think about that, definitely this is something that will enable us to connect with each other. So for me, it's also part of my own commitment and my learning process and my growth and the people who have mentored me.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I think it's really powerful to say that like we have a lot to learn from each other, because looking at other struggles is how I try to conduct myself in SDS. So I just really want to shout that out. The next question is, as students and people generally in the United States, how can we make changes on our campus and in our institutions all the way here in the United States?
First of all, I'm saying you are already doing it. So a lot of the younger people today, I was a student once, I was involved in the Palestinian student organizing and student movements in the General Union of Palestine Students and so on. And I've been in different places, from Birzeit University to abroad to the US, so every context has its own ways. So I think people are doing amazing work, and that's really, really great. I think one of the challenges we have, and I'm talking about faculty, students, staff, on campuses and communities and so on, is the rising repression, which I've been struggling with this, but I really believe we are experiencing a fascist moment. We're experiencing fascism in terms of repression, and we're experiencing it even worse, I would say, than even McCarthyism or COINTELPRO or the incarceration of Japanese people in concentration camps, or the anti-communist red baiting, or we're talking about the turn of the 20th century of the expulsion of the anarchists and the socialists and the radicals and so on. I think the US has perfected all these repressive tools. And of course, they are very much in connection with other places. So if you kind of like go around the struggle around Cop City and the people who are opposing Cop City, if you think about the project of Deadly Exchange that exposes the Anti-Defamation League training Israeli and US together, military and police together and so on, they all read the same memos and they practice similar things and so on. So I think we really need to think about what's happening today, because again, there is certain things that are going is that the exceptionalize Palestine and say it's just Palestinian, but it's not just Palestinian, because we've been hearing about attacks on critical race theory. We've been hearing about attacks about women and gender studies. We've been hearing attacks against LGBTQI plus studies inside and outside, and we've been hearing of extensive rising even frames of discipline and punishment and criminalization, anything that you do. The campus is supposed to be the space where younger people flourish and think and grow and work with each other and form social movements and be prepared to change the world when they graduate. The goal of the other people are actually to create docile citizens that when they graduate, they go and reproduce the status quo. So there is like a huge conflict between two agendas. But I think the more that they are getting nasty today and the more they are getting repressive, it is the fight back is amazing. So let's say, for example, Columbia University, they shut down Students for Justice in Palestine and shut down Jewish Voice for Peace. They went and created a new coalition. The students created a new coalition. The faculty is supporting them. And after the Israeli soldiers threw skunk water at Palestinian, SJP students, which is very similar to what Israel uses and what some of the stuff has been used here and in South Africa, by the way, against protesters and so on. People went, everybody from the community went. It was 2 days ago or the day before. Huge demonstrations. Many people got arrested. The ways in which people are saying, you know what, we are going to make up normal. We're not going to allow the normalization of repression. And that's one very important way. So people are fighting back, refusing this whole labeling that the Zionists place on us, because it's the easiest thing to talk about, given the history of the Holocaust, given the tragedy of 6 million Jews being burned in concentration camps. It's sort of like a catchphrase for the Zionists to say, oh, this is anti-Semitic. We know it's not. We know that maybe half or 40% of the movement are also Jewish students who do not want Israel to speak in their name. But they do believe never again for anybody, because they are not of the generation that has supported, Israel and thought that Israel is like the fantasy land and whatever and so on. So there and it's not just Jewish students, it's students from all over of backgrounds, along with Palestinian, Arab, Muslim students, everybody coming together, faculty as well. And I think one of the most important things that's happening is that the wall of fear has been broken. That people are no longer afraid of being disciplined, and then when they see something coming down from the university administration, they're recognizing for what it is. Another tool to silence us, to shut us up, to prevent us from speaking up, because the whole purpose of the pro-Israel movement is to actually shield Israel from criticism, to work on its public relations. This has been a very important project for Israel since before Israel was founded and after. The call, it's a question of security, public relations, very important for Israel. So having actually speaking about it and exposing it, in addition to the social media that we're hearing, whichever we get, very little we get because Israel keeps shutting off communication and so on. But even on top of that, the fact that people are no longer afraid, that they say, you're wrong. We're not actually going to be on the defensive. We're not going to engage in the business of actually defending ourselves against something that's already a lie. We're going to be engaging with each other, coming with each other, because we all believe in creating a different world. So I think to me, I'm very proud and honored to be part of the movement. I'm proud that I have been fighting for the last, 15, 16 years at San Francisco State against all of this Zionist incursion and attacks and labeling, spearing, lawsuit, and so on and so forth. And I'm kind of like, and I wasn't doing it alone, because if I didn't have everybody have my back, I would have never been able to last. And I think this is the solidarity that people are coming together. What you are doing, challenging the JNF, a group of young people coming together and doing something like this, using the university campus to learn, because it's part of learning. We always talk about extracurricular activity. How come extracurricular activity stops when it comes to Palestine? Why? Why is that the case? So every time, I think the fact that we're throwing the questions back at them, and not only throwing the question, you throw the questions back at them and then you go about doing what you need to do. Don't waste your time too much with all these, the stuff that they churn, because don't forget, all these administrations have nothing else to do. They get paid to push papers. They get paid to come up with the best bureaucracy to repress people. Their job is disciplinary mechanism. That's what they need to do. That's their goals. So we defend ourselves, but we continue doing what we're doing, building solidarity with each other, understanding each other. And it's really, really important, because otherwise we will get gaslighted. It's very easy to get gaslighted. It's very easy to make us think that we're really crazy or too radical, and maybe we need to cool it, and we need to stop, and so on. But there is also not only power in numbers quantitatively, but qualitatively. When we come together and exchange experiences, talk about what has happened, say, okay, this worked in my case, maybe it will work in your case, and so on. You don't feel so alone, and you don't feel so persecuted. And this is the whole recipe for actually social movements that are about change. So I think you're doing everything that needs to be done. I think what we all need to do is just to compare. Like, say, oh, this is what happened to us. This is how we dealt with it. So sometimes I hear that, oh my God, they canceled an event. I'm like, I'll tell you, now back in the 80s, we reserved Martin Luther King School to have an event of Palestine Solidarity, International Day of Solidarity. And they canceled all us. The custodian canceled all, because the Board of Education in New York and City Council, very pro-Zionist, pressured them. And we went and fought against them, and we threatened to go to the media, and we had the contract, and we were able to have the event. But of course, they sent spies to spy on us and intimidate our speakers and really, really be disrespectful to them, and so on. So it goes back and forth. It always goes back and forth. But I think, like, a lot of the stuff that I was seeing when I was much younger, and organizer and so on, we're seeing worse of it today. But I think many of us can say, oh my God, this reminds me of what Israel has done at the checkpoint. This reminds me of what has happened here. This is like you talk to comrades from South Africa, oh wow, this is what's going on with us. From around the world, people, the veterans of 68 strike at San Francisco State, many of them have passed on, but many of them have already told us that this is exactly what has happened. The fact that there is a bail system to pay the bail for people who go in prison, it's an amazing act of solidarity. Because why should people subject themselves to getting arrested if they do not know that somebody's going to have their back? They might get beaten up in prison, they might be killed, and so on. So I think there is amazing solidarity that's happening. And the biggest challenge between us is, are we able to build the movements strong enough and shift the balance of forces fast enough to stop the genocide, to stop the carnage? This is really the biggest challenge, because people in Palestine are steadfastness. They're resisting. They're refusing to accept subjugating and surrender. And people outside the movements, all our movements are doing it. It's just a question of how fast can we accomplish what we need to do, because the question is a matter of urgency.
Okay, thank you so much. That's the end of the questions that we had. I wanted to open up to the audience to ask any questions of either of our speakers today, if they had just ask them.
Khalid, if you don't mind, repeat the question again, because then it comes out on the closed captioning, so I can hear what people are saying.
Okay, I'll be sure to do that.
Just to jump back to colonialism, I've heard people use the word neo-colonialism, and then we just talk about colonialism like as it's. How do you use the term neo-colonialism, and how would you distinguish between the two, or what's different about it now, as opposed to other points in history? That's your question.
You use the term neo-colonialism. How do you differentiate between the two? And what was that last part?
I mean, that's basically it.
Yeah.
I don't only talk about new colonialism. I actually distinguish between settler colonialism, classical colonialism, neo-colonialism, and I don't use the term post-colonialism because I don't really believe it exists. I think, we're I would say anti-colonial, like I described the Palestinian movement as an anti-colonial movement. We are struggling against colonialism. And I think it's actually really important, and it's also because there is a difference between, like, let's say classical colonialism that went, occupied, pillaged, took away the resources, subjugated people, destroyed their societies, cultures, structures, and everything else, but went back home to their own colonies, and settler colonialism that actually went there to stay. I think it is different. Within settler colonialism, there are differences, but I think, and a lot of the time we talk about neo-colonialism in terms of how, I would say maybe in the best model, maybe people are familiar with Frantz Fanon, especially the one of the most important treatises, The Wretched of the Earth, but also his own writings. He used to write once a week an article in the Front for National Liberation in Algeria called Al-Mujahid. Every week he had an article and so on. So there are their collections in different places. And so he actually discusses, so what happens, say, after we get to quote unquote the post-colonial state, how much damage colonialism has left among the colonized people, because it's not only the destruction of the industry, of the economy, of the land, of the environment, it's the necessity of decolonizing the minds. This is probably one of the most challenging things, which is actually relates to what I was saying before, is that when people understand what's going on and say, we're not afraid anymore. First, you understand, then once you understand, you act on it, but then in acting on it, you have other people who have your back. So I think this is very, very important. But I think another thing is to think about is what has changed in terms of what's going on today with the structures of repression that are different than even before. They were at least claiming to be for academic freedom. Today, none of that is even, they're not ashamed anymore. They're right in your face, naked, violating even the Constitution that they keep defending, that the First Amendment, that they keep saying our values and so on. They're not even defending their own values that they've set up. They are violating it, and they're violating the First Amendment. They're violating freedom of speech. And they say, oh, except. When you do too many exceptions, you can't actually have a rule. It's impossible to do that. So even in that, I think there's several things that happen. They're very frantic because I know Israel is losing the public relations. They're gaining in terms of like killing more and more and more Palestinians. That's the only victory they're achieving, is how many people's blood is on their hands. That's it. That's what they're doing. That they're going to come down in history is probably the most bloody settler colonial regime in history. Other than that, they're not making any victories whatsoever. Their war strategy keeps scrambling. They don't know what to do. They keep going here and there. Every single day they change and so on. There is a huge rift within Israeli society because all the ills of a settler colonial regime is coming out, is getting exposed now. But the Zionist pro-Israel movement, which I call the Israel lobby industries, because it's not just AIPAC, it's actually a whole lot of industries, are really frantic and desperate because they cannot defend Israel. They can. How can you defend it? It's not defensible. So what they try to do is they try several things. One is they decenter the focus from what's happening, the real thing of what's happening, and they place it onto Jewish students are feeling uncomfortable. First of all, they can't really speak for all Jewish students. They can speak for some Zionist students. Secondly, it doesn't even stand the test of time. Like in my own university, there was a study that the university president commissioned with Hillel and the Academic Engagement Network, saying that the conclusion that Jewish students feel uncomfortable. But every single question they're asking students, that's not what the students are saying. So it in itself, the study, it's faulty. And then they always say, we speak for all Jewish students and anti-Zionist students. And they say, no, you don't speak for us. No, you don't speak for us at all. And we're not feeling uncomfortable and we're not feeling unsafe. Actually, we're part of this movement here and there. So I think that is creating a very, very serious problem. And then also the deflecting from what is really going on and changing things to something else. So I think and then the whole question is that all these neoliberal establishments that are very much part and parcel of imperialist structures and military industries and so on are working with this. So this is what's happening everywhere. So I think this is all connected also with the neoliberal mentality. But the last point I want to say is what happens when colonized people also internalize colonialism. So in terms of like, some people will call it the native informant. Edward Said likes to use that term, native informants. Sometimes in Frantz Fanon, he talks about internalized colonialism. In Arabic, we say Uqdat al-Khawaja, the complex of the foreigner who's ruling us and so on. So all of these things is kind of like internalizing what the oppressors say and going by their own discourse and then applying it to us. And so we end up being on the defensive rather than saying, I'm not going to answer on your terms. I'm going to answer on my terms. I'm going to put my life on my own terms. So I think that's actually one of the hardest thing. And this is why they're always desperate to try to find people from among our communities to kind of say, see, they give them legitimacy. If you recall, every time Trump has a campaign, he always has a black man behind him, like as if actually black people are supporting him. I mean, it is always, it's very desperate, and we know it's a lie, but they are so at work, and Israel is the same thing too. They are so worried about the whole question of legitimacy, and the Palestinians would not give them legitimacy, would not, even though the PLO made a big mistake, which many of us are completely against, of recognizing Israel as a state. Now they want the Palestinians to recognize Israel as a Jewish state, i.e., they want them to say that the settler colonial project in Palestine is a legitimate project, and Palestinians are not going to do it. So, and why is this concern? Like, none of us are going around saying, please recognize me because I'm Palestinian and so on. We know we are. Like, people who are colonized, who are on their own, standing on their own, are in their own skin, in their own terms and so on, do not really need to be legitimized by others. It's only the oppressors who always want to have the oppressed come and stamp and recognize what it is, which is also part of it is collective punishment, part of it is breaking their spirit. So they will stop fighting, and everybody who supports them stop supporting them. I hope that was, you know, like, address what you said, but maybe Khalid and other folks have other things to add.
I have a quick question. I did come in late, so I'm sorry if you already addressed this, but what sort of media should we try to be getting our news from, since a lot of, like, New York Times, you specifically said, and a lot of the other media that is available that we usually consider, like, you know, reputable, tends to take, like, the Israeli perspective.
Yeah, so the question was, what kind of media should we get our news from?
Would definitely say read the New York Times only to trash it. And I would say, you know, just put up with the I mean, it gives me a heart attack. I read it and I have an indigestion, because it's like every single word has a subtext, and every word that is chosen in order to defend Israel. It's sort of like the mouthpiece for Zionism. And they pretend to be soft Zionists. They're not even soft Zionists. They're hardcore Zionists. And they're legitimizing genocide and so on. But I would say there is a lot of alternative. Well, now we say alternative, but it's no longer just alternative. It's actually a very big body of media that's coming from Palestinians who, despite the very difficult conditions, are reporting, are telling us what's going on. There is a lot of places that analyze, from Mundo Wise to Electronic Intifada to the Gray Zone to the Intercept, and I hope I didn't forget, because they're amazing. They're doing Middle East Eye, and the TV stations and so on. They're doing amazing work. So they're actually, I actually can't keep up with all the stuff that's coming on. So it's more work, because you have to read the so-called the paper of record, especially if you're an educator, and especially if you are also in dealing with other intellectuals and scholars and so on. But you also, it's really important. And I feel like a lot energized when I read stuff from Palestinian news agencies, because it gives me the whole rampant everything that's going on, instead of only focusing on something, you know, that the New York Times, for example, only reports maybe 2-3 weeks after something happens, when they think it becomes a story. So they have to actually put their stamp on it or something. So I think, I mean, I don't think we're going to be able to change the mainstream or the dominant hegemonic media anytime soon, because they are owned by big corporations. They are owned by war industry, corporations and so on. And that's not a joke. I mean, there are specific interests. This whole thing about the media being neutral and so on, it's a mirage. It doesn't really exist. They represent particular interests. So, and I think there is no such thing, even for students in journalism, there is no such thing as neutral, or because in situations of justice and injustice, there is no innocent bystanders. You are either condoning injustice or you're standing up for justice. In the very least, if you take out your camera, your phone, and you start recording a police bomb beating up on somebody. That's it. I don't. And then this whole mirage that they also tell us in the academy, that you need to do like unbiased, value-free research and so on. There is no such thing. Everybody comes with their own ideas to the field, and the field that already has its own ideas. All of this stuff already exists. already is there. So to actually pretend that it doesn't exist means that we are participating in perpetuating the status quo and perpetuating oppression and normalizing oppression and signing on that this is okay. So I think we need to question everything and kind of like, we need to know what they are saying. But then I would just say, you know, for me, I spare myself. I would suggest a little bit, I don't watch any TV at all. Like I'll see whatever reports are being sent on, and then I will read the New York Times, which again, I said, it gives me indigestion, gives me dagger in my heart, and so on. And I have all sorts of red scribbled all over it. But then I also go and watch what people are saying in Palestine. How are they being resilient? And I really like even some of the reporting when there are like kids come and start singing, playing, or there are, you know, adults that are entertaining the kids, taking care of them, where our families, I mean, it's just the situation is so bad that people are being in support of each other and so on. Because I think it's really important for us in the struggle also not to lose our humanity, not allow this very nasty genocide to make us jaded, and to stay real to our principles, to our rights, to our goals, to be able to continue fighting. And I would just, I didn't say that before, but I'll say it now, that we're in it for the long term. This is a very long, protracted struggle. So it's really important to also kind of like pace ourselves so we don't get burned right away, you know, and like, you know, have battle fatigue or whatever. We're in it for a very long time. So we need to just make sure, and we need to protect our own. So if like somebody doesn't really need to be arrested, or if their arrest is going to be creating too many problems for them, for their families, and for the movement, they don't need to get arrested. It's not about you know, a competition of bravery. It's about thinking collectively, engaging collectively, working with each other collectively, and figuring out what we need to do and what are the best strategies for us to accomplish, and always compare notes with each other. Because, you know, we always learn from each other. We hear something and somebody else says something else. That's where we're at.
Okay, thank you so much. I know that some folks might have another class coming up, so I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank everybody for coming. You know, and yeah, and if anybody has to leave, just take as much snacks as you like. But the next question comes from someone online. It says, I want to ask the professor if they consider the Nakba to be one continuous event, similarly to the indigenous Turtle Islander, Native American genocide.
Yes, I do. I think it's a continuous. And I think when we, every time we commemorate the Nakba, we say the Nakba continues. Because once, if we have not eliminated the roots of the Nakba, the outcome of the Nakba hasn't stopped. It continues again and again and again, understanding what does it mean. And I do agree with Khaled that this is, would say, a second Nakba, but I was actually saying that the genocide that's going on today, not just at the displacement, is something that of proportions that we have not even seen, even in 1948. I mean, it's horrendous. So yeah, definitely the Nakba continues. We always say, Nakba continues, or we always add, so does the resistance.
Thank you. And then is there any, I have another question online, but I want to give folks in the room a chance to also ask a question. All right, the next question is, what are the professor's thought on the culture of the colonizer in general, and would she consider colonial culture to be a pseudo-culture centered on the erasure and aesthetic assimilation of the victim's culture?
Okay, so I'm going to say something that maybe some people might think is controversial, but I would just, I'm going to invite everybody to analyze this Nova Electronic Music Festival. Like, because people only said that they were there, but nobody, very few people, I haven't seen a lot questioning, what is it? that all those people are going, and by the way, a lot interviewed and said, oh, I knew there was bombing. I saw attacks, I saw missiles, I saw bombing of Gaza and so on. It didn't faze them. So it's kind of like, what are you doing there? This is a colonial culture. This is, and it's, by the way, you want to go back to the Turtle Island question. This is a lot of these folks who actually think that, oh, they're being closer to the environment and so on. They're protecting the environment more. So they're actually going and colonizing more and more and more spaces. And they pretend, they claim that they actually care for the environment more than the indigenous people. There's a film I show, a document I show, I mentioned Ain Hod. It's called 500 Dunums on the Moon. And it's about Ain Hod. I don't know if any of you have seen it, but if you haven't, I would highly recommend it because it actually shows how the settler colony have been created and what the colonist artists are saying about the Palestinians. They're actually saying, oh, they didn't care for their homes, so we're coming and preserving it more. You're destroying everything. Almost every single institution in Gaza, 500 years, 1,000 years, been destroyed. And then you actually come and you say that you are preserving, which is very similar to kind of like what's happening today, including also collecting bones and body parts of indigenous people and putting them in museum, displaying them in museum and so on, and refusing to return them, and artifacts and so on and so forth. This is all part of the colonial culture, and it's all part of a culture of privilege, of entitlement, of white supremacy, of racism, of a group of people that think they are better than anybody else. And that gives them the right to pillage, to take whatever it is. And then they start telling us, oh, France is negotiating with African countries how to return. What do you mean? You should have never pillaged it in the first place. You should not have obelisks in Paris or anywhere else. They belong to in Egypt. So I think this is kind of like, this is very, very much part of the colonial culture that people normalize it and think it's all right. So I think like an incomplete project in the US, for example, all the evidence of confederacy, all the statues, everything else, you either destroy them or you put them in a back room and so on until you are ready to actually teach about them right. Not to actually just put them there and have everybody celebrate them. It's really, really important to contest all of that because it's become so much part of the normalized everyday scene that you can't even stop and think, oh my God, this is what's going on. What am I saying? Am I meeting at this street? I'm actually meeting at this street that's called Golda Meir. I'm meeting at this street that's called Rabin. I'm meeting at this one that's called, Theodore Roosevelt. I'm like, are we realizing what we are talking about? Like, do we know what we're talking about and why this is really problematic? And what does it mean to ingrain in our minds as adults? Imagine kids who are in school that day in and day out being taught doses of accepting inferiority, of accepting less than, of accepting the status quo, of accepting oppression. So colonial culture, I mean, think about the food, think about hummus, think about Palestinian embroidery, everything. I mean, Palestine is very strong, but it's everywhere also. Everywhere, it's all happening, including the whole question of sampling, like foods and so on. When I was in Michigan, when I was directing the Center for Arab American Studies, I have to tell you, many of my colleagues who do not know much about the community and so on, who has all the stereotype, knew every single restaurant, every single Arabic restaurant in Dearborn, everyone. And they knew which one of them had better hummus than me, better than me, right? And they will come and tell me that. But when you talk about it, they'll say, oh, but they're religious. She's wearing a scarf. They're conservative. I'm like, how do you know? Did you talk to them? No, I haven't. So why do you make this? And so all the stereotypes are there. Meanwhile, they're the best experts on what the food is like and what it is. So this is kind of like, this runs so deep, and this is where we, at the time when we need somebody like, not just like Fanon, all the readings and the thinking and the ways and the praxis that is happening in different places, and not all of it in English. A lot of it, unfortunately, a lot of this stuff, like I use a lot of Arabic references, but not everybody has access to people's cultures from other parts of the world because of the monopoly of English, and it's being acted as an imperialist tool.
Okay, we have another question online. Assalamu alaikum. I'm a Palestinian. Are you willing to share your information, as I would like to invite you to do more of the sessions in the community? Thank you. It's been extremely informative listening to you today. I have learned so much, even as a Palestinian who grew up in the first Intifada.
Thank you so much. And please feel free to share all of this stuff. The only thing I would say is I actually don't say first. I don't use first and second because there have been so many intifadas. And so, I mean, I know everybody says that, the first intifada. They refer to the intifada of the stone of 1987. But there have been so many uprisings throughout the history of Palestine, including the 1936-39 Great Revolt, the uprisings after the Balfour Declaration was attacked. There is so much. Our history is replete with uprisings. So I would just, I think please feel free to use this. Please go to our websites. We have for Teaching Palestine and for Ahmed, Arab and Muslim Ethnicity and Diaspora Studies, and Facebook, on Instagram, and on X. All of this stuff is available. Actually, we have, I think almost every single open classroom is on YouTube. And some of them are actually with people who have passed, that we've had them, they speak, they say their own words and so on. And I have to go, I mean, I've set up a lot of these things, but I go back a lot of the times to kind of remind myself of what people have said, the analysis, because sometimes you miss it in the moment of like a two-hour event. So we have a lot, and I would really welcome you. Please feel free to use, share, whatever you want. Get everybody to have study groups, work with each other. I think that's really, really, really important for us. I mean, it's kind of like people always ask, do the colonized have the responsibility to educate the colonizers? And we have multiple tasks, because when we are in a society that's very mixed up, you need to do all of it. But I would just say that our own communities and our own peoples, and I'm not talking only about Arabs, Muslims, and Palestinians, all of us who are struggling for justice, for freedom, for peace, for another world, and so on, we all have a responsibility to educate each other, to critique each other, but in a sort of like a tough love kind of way, not in a destructive kind of criticism and self-criticism. Work with each other, learn with each other, and so on. I mean, we never stop. When we're eating, when we're walking, when we're taking a walk, when we're going to a picnic, all the time we are learning. And I think we have so much material. So please help yourself to whatever is out there.
Okay. Is there any other questions in the crowd?
What is like the name to look at for that material?
Oh, it's or if you want to say it. The question was what is the name to find the material you were just talking about?
Yeah, there is I'm going to say it very slowly. Teaching Palestine, pedagogical praxis and the indivisibility of justice. And you will find us on Instagram, on Facebook, and on X. And then the second one is the academic program I set up that we're still surviving despite the fact that the university would like to destroy it in collusion with the Zionists, which is called Arab and Muslim Ethnicities and Diaspora Studies program. And check out our social media, again, Instagram, Facebook, and X, because the site on San Francisco State University, they've changed it. They took out all the Arabic. They took out a lot of the stuff that we've done, and they made it a site for donations because, like Palestine is sexy now. Arabs and Muslims are sexy now, so they can raise money. We don't see a penny, by the way, out of it. So I wouldn't direct you to that until we are able to kind of gain back our website and what we need to do. Meanwhile, check out the social media. It's all available. YouTube also has tons of videos. You can just say Ahmed at SFSU, and then all the videos will come up, and you can decide which one you want to watch, and so on. And we're in the process of also creating a website. There is my academia.edu is very outdated. Tons of my writings is not up there, but just honestly, it's a question of priorities. Gaza now is the priority, so we'll be able to do that later on.
Okay. We're gonna do our last question comes from online, from Linda. It's how do we encourage our community to engage in advocacy?
It's very difficult. I think it's very difficult only because people realize the risks, and they know that they would like to protect their children, their family members, and so on. But I think people can participate in different kinds of advocacies that are manageable. I mean, they can, when people say, call the White House and bombard them with calls, call them. I'm not saying that Biden is going to change, but definitely is having an effect because the staff of the White House is resigning. I mean, People who have good, they're refusing to participate in this. When people say there is a protest, go to the protest. When there is a vigil, go to the vigil. When there is a need for donations for the people on bail, do it. When there is a need to make donations for people in Gaza, do it. When we can write and like let your neighbor know, somebody else, and so on. I mean, there are certain levels. I think some people, you can't just come up and say, you know, go and do all of this stuff 24-hour and so on. And some people are happy to do 24-hour. I just say, honestly, from my own experience, as a long-time organizer and activist, I always believe in what Emma Goldman said. If I want to dance in the revolution, if I can't dance in the revolution, I don't want to be part in it. The revolution, we're in it because we actually want to create a better world. We're in it for life. We're in it to protect all our communities. So it's okay for us to smile. I mean, now it's very difficult with what's going on in Gaza. It's really hard to even smile. But I would just say pace ourselves. Again, I'll say pace ourselves. People take the pressure. Some people do the work. Other people take off. Talk to some people. I think it's one first time you have like people in the communities being able to come and see that this is not really crazy, because you know you're working against very difficult propaganda that portrays all of us as crazy. I mean, this is why I think it's really important to have a sense of community so you don't get gaslighted. It's really, really, really important. It's the strength. Okay, so I think there are ways for people to, and now today, there are so many possibilities for people to participate that it sort of imposes it upon itself. It might not be 100% advocacy, but it might be 1%, 2%, 3%. That's okay. Allah Kareem, we'll do more. You know, we will continue doing it. I mean, it takes a very, very long time. I have to tell you, I'm in it until I die. I believe in it. I believe that we will be victorious. If I am not, maybe the next generation or other people will be victorious from our other siblings around the world and so on. So, I mean, when Standing Rock was able to stop the pipeline, it was amazing. I mean, this is, let's take also all the little victories and also think about them and celebrate them, because we are acting against a very, very vicious and very powerful system. So everything we achieve is great. The fact that we're able to be here, honestly, I was telling you, I'm so exhausted because I'm doing so much of this, but then I come to speak to you now, I'm so energized. Like I want to just go out and organize a protest or do something and so on. Because it's just like, it's really lovely to be able to do this and hear and engage with each other and hear very, very intelligent questions, very important questions, and to be able to answer them and think about them. Every time a question comes in a different form. So it keeps my mind going all the time. So even this, I'm just so thankful to all of you for hosting me. Even not the best, under the best circumstances, you are in a room, I'm on the screen. I think it's okay. We'll make it happen. Thank God for the screen. Okay, so it's fine. We will do whatever we can do. I think this is just like, let's take pride in that we are continuing. We have not been defeated and we will not be defeated and we will not be silenced. So thank you.
All right, and with that, this event comes to an end. I wanted to first thank Professor Abdulhadi for coming in all the way, zooming in all the way from San Francisco. I know that it was by chance that we caught each other, but I'm glad that you're able to come and speak to us today and provide so much firsthand experience and so with your wealth of knowledge. I'm excited that you were able to share that with us. And I also want to again thank the audience and everybody who's able to come out today. Just a couple of announcements. If you would like the link to the Abdulhadi had for us, just reach out to me. I will be sure to get those out to everybody. And then Linda from the Colorado Palestine Coalition also wanted to let everybody know that they are working on canvassing for Tim Hernandez, and if anybody is interested in that, to let me know and I can get you connected with her. What we like to do in SDS at the end of all of our actions is that, we also have a petition here calling for an end to US aid to Israel and calling for our universities to divest from weapon corporations. Let me get that passed around. But what we like to do at the end of at the end of a lot of actions is that we raise our left fist and then we say 3, 2, 1, and we yell out otro golpe. and we slam it down on the nearest consenting surface. We get this from Colombian revolutionaries, and it means another blow, because every time we meet, every time we organize, it's another blow against the systems that oppress us. So 3, 2, 1. Otro golpe.
Thank you.
No problem. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you everybody online for giving questions and letting everybody know as well. Message in the chat if you'd like to get like connected with Dr. Abdulhadi, and I'll do my best to reach out to everybody.
I got a lot of material.
No, that's it. That was actually.